Hey everybody, welcome back to A Higher Future. This is UB Simignetti along with my partner in good, Dr. Nicole Gravagna. Hello,
Hi,
Doc.
Yubi.
How
Who do
are
we
you?
have with us today?
Well, we've got this is going to be a really fascinating conversation. There's a lot of intersections with what Bob Pulver, who is our guest, what he's done in his career, what he's aspiring to, and what he's doing now. So Bob is a technology leader, future of work kind of strategist, if you will, formerly working at IBM and then NBC Universal. And what I love from something you said in your bio was the future of work is driven by people, augmented by technology. And I love that. And I feel like that really encompasses a lot of the work that you're doing. And it's something that's near and dear to our hearts, at Interview IA. But first of all, Bob, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm doing great. Yubi, thanks. Thanks for having me. Nice to
Yeah,
see you, Nicole.
absolutely. So talk to us. So let's dive into that for a second,
Sure.
to kind of kick it off. Like, talk to us a little bit about how you've got to this, this belief, right? That talent and tech, and people. Like it's there's a coexistence there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I started my career. My first real job was at IBM down in Atlanta, and I think when I got that job, and I actually started as a contractor, and then because they were in a hiring freeze at the time, this was way back. I don't even want to date myself and say how long ago it was, but it was a while ago, and so I noticed
Yeah.
that the way that they were identifying talent, either to onboard or to in terms of leadership development and advancement, it just seemed like it was very either arbitrary or relationship driven, or there were a lot of biases in the system. And so I wound up navigating my own sort of nonlinear path through different opportunities at IBM, and a lot of those were sort of bridging business and technical challenges, things around systems engineering, building product management before it was called product management, so managing requirements across a lot of different stakeholders. And so technology was always being introduced. I felt like my whole 20 plus years at IBM, they were going through some type of transformation the entire time. And so really I started thinking more deeply about behavior. I started getting involved in enterprise innovation projects, crowdsourcing, collective intelligence, thinking about how do we actually form an optimal team? How do you find the right person for the right role, but also that they have complementary skills to the other people on the team so that the whole team is successful. And so, I also saw challenges in performance management systems. I saw, and so I just felt like, are people really thinking about what motivates people? Are they really thinking bigger picture about where this person's sort of career trajectory could take them? And I just sort of formed my own path and started getting involved in a lot of different experiences at IBM. So a lot of them were internal, but some of them were client facing. In fact, my longest tenure at IBM was a client facing role working with IBM Research. So basically helping the sales teams connect clients with what research was working on. So don't just try to pitch them on, what's on the truck, so to speak, but what's coming down the pike in H1, H2, even H3 kinds of horizons that are going to potentially disrupt their business and their industry. So how do they think about not just product innovation, but business model innovation? How do they streamline processes to save costs? How do they think about knowledge management and the retaining institutional knowledge? So back then it was around building these large scale complex sort of decision tree models and things like that. And then how does that start to evolve to automate some of that? I remember a technology called Expert Conversation Builder, and how do you incorporate the lifetime value of customers, and by looking at their behavior on a website. And you could start to, and IBM started making acquisitions in the commerce space, right? Like how do you sort of follow anonymously, how do you sort of follow someone's, digital footprints around a website so that you can, increase retention and decrease, shopping cart abandonment and all those kinds of things. And um, so technology in the analytics space just started getting more and more advanced. You weren't just looking at structured data; you were analyzing unstructured data like social media, finding sentiment and emotion and tone in social media, understanding people's profiles. Now, how do you marry that with their actual transactional history and things like that to understand and anticipate what customers might want? So I was always intrigued by these sort of blends of technology and people. And then, to me, what's much more meaningful is not just figuring out how to sell an extra widget to somebody or, get them to click on another ad, but well, what about people in the sense that people are the source of, they are the culture, they are the lifeblood of your organization. Strategy doesn't execute itself, right? So how do we optimally, go forward and do that in such a way that, computers can do what they do best and humans can do what they do best. We've seen a lot of blurring of that of late, right? Because AI is starting to try to do, what we typically assumed were human only, tasks, right? And I think of things in the creative space where it's actually, writing copy, or it's, trying to learn enough to be its own artist.
Yeah, and on that front,
Yeah.
so you saw the AI renaissance, right?
In a way, yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the way, I guess one of the interesting experiences, again, the longest tenure I had was working with IBM Research, and during that time, there was a research project called Deep QA, Deep Question Answering, that was the precursor to what's now known as IBM Watson. So coming out of this research lab, and it wasn't just the IBM headquarters research lab here in Westchester County, New York. There were a lot of different research labs around the world, all working on some component of this. But when researchers used to come over to my lab next door and talk to clients about some of this, like this is what's going to change the way you operate. And we're working on, they were working on industry specific use cases. They started in the medical, healthcare domain to be like almost like a second opinion kind of, doctor, if you can imagine that. And it would basically be trained to, there's a set of, unknown unknowns, and then there's known unknowns. So Watson would basically learn, it knew what it didn't know. And so then it could then go out and seek that knowledge that it was missing. So I just was fascinated by the way that this was coming about, and it made, on some level, it made a lot of sense to me. On another level, I was like, I'm just not even close to smart enough to be working, to be even in the presence of these people.
Isn't that the idea, to augment the intelligence?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Well,
right.
isn't that why they put Watson on Jeopardy? Wasn't it to sort of ease that, uncertainty that we might have with a technology like that?
Well, they did that, and that was part of it, I think. But it was also, I mean, keep in mind, this was a more sort of generalized intelligence, which people think we still have not achieved, right? So,
sure.
So it was really, it was actually what IBM used to call a grand challenge. So it was like a moonshot kind of thing. They did not, I'm sure some people had some level of confidence that it could do this, but if you think about, if you're a fan of Jeopardy, it's not just a matter of coming up with the right answers. You've got to actually click in. You've got to have good reflexes to click in, which I think was a controversial topic with Watson. When could it actually click in? Because it didn't have hearing to actually hear when the question was finished. But also you had to just, even the betting part was a whole nother aspect. They had to have their own algorithms just to know in what situations to bet, certain amounts and things like that, to actually win, come out and win the game. Even if you answered all the questions, you may not win depending on the betting situation.
I can't remember. Did he win?
Amazing. He did.
Okay.
He did, yeah. But yeah, we had a makeshift Jeopardy studio in my office. I
Crazy.
got to meet Alex Trebek and then the guest host who was doing all the mock games.
Uh-huh.
I forget his name, but yeah, it was an amazing experience. But yeah, that sort of renewed my interest in this intersection of technology and talent, and so it led me to eventually I was working in consulting, selling some of these cognitive services, as they called it, basically, Watson-based, APIs in the social analytics space, and then eventually led to my last role at IBM, which was running this cognitive build program. It was basically this entrepreneurial, program where people came up with, they learned what these cognitive services could do. So basically, they upskilled the entire organization, or at least 2/3 of it participated in upskilling in cloud and AI, analytics, and I forget one other category. And then they said, okay, now tell us what ideas you have to use this technology. So everyone went and created an idea. They formed a team. They pitched it. They did crowdfunding. They did a Shark Tank exercise to try to get buy-in. And then they were crowdfunding. The best ones rose to the top and pitched to industry leaders and to Ginny Rometty, the CEO at the time. And yeah, and then so I had an idea a team that I led through that program, and then I was asked to actually lead the program at the end. So like the top 50 teams from around the globe joined me at the IBM World of Watson,
Wow.
global event in Vegas, and I basically ran a pitch fest and innovation panels, and had at least 25 different teams all showcasing their prototypes. Some of those which were of most interest to me were in the talent space. So how are you using IBM Watson to essentially improve the hiring, and onboarding process? How are you helping to matchmake, people to roles or people to teams? And how can I started thinking, how could this be deployed on a broad scale? If you think about, not just in the enterprise space, but small, medium businesses that don't have a huge, talent acquisition team, and maybe one person wearing multiple hats who's not even just doing talent. Maybe they're doing talent in operations, or they're doing talent in strategy, or what have you. But if you think about everything from a philanthropic perspective, or think about government programs and things like that, there's so many people out there that have so much potential, and they don't even know what they're capable of, and they don't know how to even get on that path, right? So imagine if these programs could scale to the point where before you filed for unemployment, you took an assessment and it helped you. I know some governments have programs like that, but I don't know how much sort of power is behind it, where those people can actually now be parsed as a sort of warm pipeline to different companies and things like that. But there's a tremendous opportunity to sort of level up countless individuals,
There
not to
really
mention
is. It's
reskill.
fascinating. There was a paper I read recently in the physics and engineering space. It's not STEM,
Yeah,
there's another acronym. And they looked at, every field has low performers, mid performers, and high performers. And they looked across the field and they looked for women and people of color, and then separated out white men who traditionally allowed into the field. And
yeah,
so when you found, like, at the very top end of the field, the super high performers, it was actually quite balanced. There were women, there were men. It was like a 2-to-1 ratio. And at the bottom of
yeah,
the field, it was like a 20-to-1 ratio, where there just weren't a lot of women or people of color at that lower end of the field. And it seems to me there's a lot of mediocre and perfectly fine physicists and engineers out there that just
yeah.
haven't quite made their way through, that we could
Right.
be tapping, because they're probably just perfectly fine.
Yeah, there were. There were plenty of studies. Again, this goes back a while in my IBM, sort of mid IBM tenure, but I did a lot of investigation around collective intelligence and collaborative decision making and things like that, and study after study from people like Professor Tom Malone from MIT, and Professor McAfee, also from MIT and Harvard, and countless others that were just like, you are increasing your collective intelligence if you have more women, and more in general, more diversity in that decision-making body. And that's why crowdsourcing was so fascinating to me, because if good ideas can come from anywhere, then you might as well make idea submissions anonymous, because otherwise you have this bias towards, if I submit an idea and, some executive vice president submits an idea, if you did that blindly, you'd get the actual, reaction to the potential of that idea. Whereas, if that EVP submits something, everyone's going to be like, oh, that's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it's like, are you sure?
Is it really? Or, yeah, that's fascinating. We talk about groupthink all the time, and in terms of hiring, right? And and also, take the lesson, leave the story. There's too often in your example, we're taking the story of, oh, well, it's the EVP, so of course it's just going to automatically be the best idea.
Yeah.
And it gets in the way.
Yeah. This happened a lot in IBM has an offering that they used to use internally called JAMS. It's basically just an open online, forum. They have moderators for different topics and things like that. And I mean, you saw it almost immediately. I mean, senior executives joined because they wanted to lead by example and make sure that people knew that, leadership was taking this seriously. But the problem was they would unintentionally, sort of commandeer, the conversation and get all the likes, and, what do you know, the top, the activity is far and away greater, where, some SVP or EVP or even the CEO were actually having engaged in the conversation. So it's fine that you're drawn to that, but you've got to account for that in your sort of, analytics, and you've got to find other ways to, elevate promising and engaging topics that came from, more of a grassroots kind of source.
When I was coaching leaders, I would always tell them, depending on where you are in the organization, your megaphone gets bigger. So it doesn't necessarily mean you get smarter. It just means that you get louder. And and I reminded them, like, you have to be super careful when you're shouting into that megaphone, because it can be blinding. Yeah, definitely,
for sure.
I suppose. Okay, so thank you for all of that. That was fabulous story, just hearing about how all of that came about.
Yeah.
But now I'd like to just talk about this idea of, we've been talking about the hybrid new way of going to the office sometimes and being on Zoom sometimes. And what are you seeing? It sounds like you have some thoughts on, what companies are going to have to do to stay relevant, and how have a vision for how that all will play out in the next couple of months and years.
Yeah, I definitely think this is a long-term trend. I think some companies are gonna wait and see, and maybe survey their employees and see, who's comfortable coming back, and what do they want or whatever. But the surveys that I've seen just in the last, say month or so, the evidence is clear as day. I mean, everyone wants some flexibility that this has afforded them. They and if they don't get it, they're probably going to leave. I mean, multiple surveys have already said, in the neighborhood of 50% of people are going to be, either actively or looking or passively looking for another role for whatever reason. So any company that isn't communicating well with their employees, they're not being transparent, and also companies that don't trust their employees to get their work done and behave like adults, um, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have trouble retaining people. You're going to have trouble acquiring talent, because people have expectations have completely changed. Now, I would say hybrid is going to mean different things to different companies. I was actually just in a conversation on Clubhouse this morning talking about this. It is going to mean different things to different companies. It depends on what role you're in, maybe what industry you're in. I mean, even a company, if I just use NBC Universal as an example, if sometimes you're in a role that you have to be there, right? Like if you're working in behind the camera in Studio 8H, recording Saturday Night Live, you can't be home, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you work at Universal Parks and Resorts, it was a nice experiment, but the park's open now, right? And so you can't, check tickets and, sell stuffed animals from your couch. So, so certain roles that have to go back. Obviously, they need to keep people's, wellness, top of mind. I think that's mental health, that's physical health and safety, and all those things are just table stakes, right? Like you've got to have that kind of stuff. For everyone else, in terms of knowledge work, I mean, sometimes it depends. Again, using NBC as an example, I used to commute to 30 Rock. NBC, Comcast, they don't own that building. Their name might be on it, but they don't own the building, right? So there's other employers that have people there. It's also a tourist destination. So you can't, the commuting to work is not done in a vacuum, right? Mm-hmm. There are other people that you need to account for. You need to understand what, Tishman Speyer, I think, owns the building. You need to know who else is going to be in the building. You need to, it's a massive sort of orchestration, challenge to figure all that out. You've got to have your safety protocols, but what are the protocols that other people in the building, or the tourists? I mean, you can't stop people. I guess, if you're on the ground floor or the mall portion on the bottom two floors, it's kind of a free for all. But what does that mean? I mean, you could have tested yourself and taken your temperature before you got in the elevator bay, but then you went to grab lunch and then you just exposed yourself to, 100 tourists. So what are you supposed to do? Yeah. Whereas if you have your own, building, I mean, it's the same probably in any kind of like co-working space too, right? They're going to have their protocols and things like that. But I mean, if you're in a small business, I mean, my wife has an office, but she's got her small companies. There's only 3 of them, and they're all, vaccinated, and they check everybody that comes to visit or whatever. But that's relatively safe. But I mean, the circumstances are going to be different, and then people's lives are different. So you have to understand what are people's commitments, and what kind of schedule might they be on. And it's not going to be everybody. Well, hybrid means 2 to 3 days a week in the office. Well, maybe it's something totally different, or maybe a certain hours a day. It also might depend on the tasks. Nicole, we were talking before about whether you can be as effective in person with your team. Well, maybe it depends on what actual activity you need to do. Is in-person collaboration, better to accomplish a task, or do it, more efficiently, more creatively, whatever it is. You've got to, as a collective, figure out what's the optimal way to get those things done. But not everyone's going to be on the same schedule, and everyone needs their own sort of quiet time. Some people may not have quiet time at home. Maybe they have 6 kids.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And pets and construction and I mean, who knows? It sounds, I mean, all of this, like, it's just, I'm sort of getting overwhelmed hearing you talk about all this stuff. So I can't even imagine like an organization, because if I'm hearing you correctly, and I think we believe this too, I mean, there is now a responsibility that organizations have that's 10 times what it used to be pre-pandemic. And that's everything from everything you just talked about to environment, safety, wellness, health, but it's also how they're going about hiring now. So to
Yeah.
your point about those roles that do require someone to be on site, the people who were in those roles before, they may not actually be the right people for those roles now. But there are people who do want to be in those roles, who do
Yeah.
want to be out and on site. So, there's this transformation that has to occur for organizations to really truly understand who they're looking for from a talent perspective. And it's
Right.
got to be super clear, transparent, and intentional. You can't just throw up a job description anymore and say, ticket person at Universal
Yeah.
Studios. Like, that's not going to
Right.
work.
Yeah. Yeah. The JD, and again, now that I'm going through, the sort of candidate experience,
Mm-hmm.
the JD, some of the JD, you can tell who's already starting to think more deeply and broadly about how they're trying to fill, certain roles. I mean, I can tell when something's not all the time, but I know a copied and pasted, JD when I see one.
Oh, yeah.
And even just the way that someone describes something like, definitely need a 4-year degree. Okay, tell me why. Definitely need 10 years of HR experience. Well, again, why? So that I know the ins and outs of some legacy HRIS
Yeah.
system
Right.
that I could probably, well, first of all, isn't that the system that we're gonna that you want to replace, right? Or isn't it like what? I don't understand.
Yeah.
So think about, I mean, certainly I'm always encouraged when I see companies that, even if they just have a blurb at the bottom, like, oh, even if you don't think you're an exact fit, if you're somebody who's really
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of drive, you're a lifelong learner, learn, you think on your feet, you're open-minded and adaptive and resilient, and all these sort of soft skill kind of buzzwords these days. But at least they're trying, and at least they're recognizing, or at least I hope they are, that um, we need to think about talent sort of matchmaking in a different way. You can't just look for
Yeah.
people like you, right? You can't, because then you don't get the diversity of thought and experience that we were talking about before. You really need to think about, you're looking at this job in isolation, as opposed to thinking about this person is a member of a team, right? Their OKRs, or whatever their goals and performance are going to be part of team goals, and those team goals will be tied to the larger organizational goals. And it's not just a sort of cascading effect like we used to do in the performance management, and then figure out where whether you've met these goals that you may not have had any control over. These are,
Mm-hmm.
what are you going to actually do so that you drive outcomes and that you deliver value? And so you've got to think about who are the people that can actually get that done. And it's a lot of, I see a lot of vendors talk about potential over, sort of, what's on your resume, because what worked for you before may not work for you in a new,
Yeah.
agile model. You were great at product, but you were doing waterfall. Right now, we need you to be working in an agile environment. There's different
Mm-hmm.
tools. There's a different set of behavior, sort of expectations, and those things aren't necessarily, relevant anymore. But if you have this, maybe you're good at that. So, working on, trying to infer things from people's prior experiences, or infer things from their social media, content. What do we know about this? We can get inside this person's head and understand
Mm-hmm.
how they think, and how that may complement the way this team thinks, or the way this leader thinks. Because if you just bring on yet another of Ivy Leaguer or ex Google developer or whatever, like why you don't even know why you need that. You just want it because everyone else wants it.
Well, it's a fascinating problem because everyone who's ever gotten a job understands the concept of how to get a job. It's something that almost everyone has done. And yet when you look at it from a data or evaluation perspective, and also like a human bias and psychology perspective, it's a really hard problem to
Yeah.
solve because
Hmm.
humans are kind of incapable of evaluating something that they don't personally know. And so how do you evaluate someone that you don't identify with and you don't really have any kind of context for their, like for me to, I've never been in the military, and I have very little context for what a military career trajectory and what happens on a day-to-day basis and what happens there. So somebody coming from as somebody who's a veteran now coming in trying to show me what their leadership skills are just by showing me their resume and by talking about their experiences in an interview, it's I still can't really, it doesn't make any sense to me on a personal level, so it's hard to
Hmm.
evaluate that. I wonder
Yeah.
how you think about those nerdy aspects of evaluating candidates
Yeah.
from your experience.
I will tell you, I've taken quite a few of these assessments myself over the last couple months, and they were, I could cherry pick and say certain things weren't really that accurate, or try to think to a couple of the questions that they asked where they may have inferred something from that. I mean, I think nothing's ever going to be perfect, but I think overall the assessments were fairly accurate. I mean, there's certain things that I'm good at, and whether that's because I'm a Virgo or a Southpaw, or whatever it is, there might be some inherent things and traits in there. But I've got some. I thought I was an introvert. It turns out I'm actually kind of an ambivert. So
Hmm.
when I love just mainly listening, but when I actually know what I'm talking about, then I'll speak up.
Uh,
Um, and so I think it helped me to learn a little bit more about myself, and also that some of the roles I've had before, um, I got them because people trusted me and they needed somebody they trusted in that particular role. But there are roles that I wouldn't really go to again because I know that it's not the optimal fit for me. Right?
hmm.
It won't. Um, it's not in their or my best interest to just put a warm body, reasonably intelligent guy,
Yep.
into that role, because there's chances are there's another role in some other group that I might be a better fit for, and if I'm a better fit, everyone's better off.
Yeah. I love that. I think that's a great way to conclude this conversation. I mean, we could keep talking. You're speaking our language, man. So thank you. I'm glad, I'm glad we got to have this conversation. And, you know, um, yeah, honestly, I think the future of work is companies have to change their approach to talent, to environment, to culture, all of it,
Yeah,
moving forward. So thanks, Bob. This was great, man. Thank you so much.
yeah, my pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for continuing to watch. Yeah, we'll see you next time. Bye.